So we had started the week before on faith in action. And basically we started looking at how we listen. And we used the example in the Bible of Jesus when he was a child. When he went to the temple at the age of 12, and he was come up missing. And Mom and Dad were looking for him and couldn't find him. And come to find out, he's in the temple, talking and answering questions and asking questions. And we were going on, how do we, using that example, how are we listening to other people? And with that example there, how often do we listen to children in their talking? I mean, when I grew up, the old adage was, a child should be seen but not heard. Everybody heard that?
Yes.
Is that true? Because what happened with Jesus? He was 12, and who was listening to him? These people in the temple, the chief priests, whatever, Pharisees and that, they were listening to him and marveling. They were awestruck at what he knew. Joe.
Well, it goes back to when remember his disciples his apostles were trying to keep the kids from him.
Right.
He said, what did he said? What belongs to them.
Right. That was in, I had that here, Matthew, I think. No, it is, I think many times we miss out on listening to Matthew 18:3. I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. What is it? Now I know that we've been in situations a lot of times where we're listening to the children and we're thinking, what are they saying? But do we truly give our best as parents? And I probably lack this same type of thing. But when we listen to our children, do we truly listen? Or do we kind of like, okay, get on with it, I've got things to do. Do we get down on their level? Do we try to understand what they're saying? Because as it said there, as Joe pointed out, Jesus said what? We have to be what? We have to be like children. How much do children absorb? When they're listening to things, how much do they absorb? Everything, don't they? How are we to listen? Shouldn't we listen kind of like them too? Should we be absorbing the things that are being taught to us? And yet, as we grow older, what happens? We get a little smarter, too smart for our britches, don't we? We think, yeah, that's what it says, but I've got my own thoughts, and I'm not going to listen to that. I'm going to create my own. It tells us in Proverbs, train up a child in the way it should go, and when he is old, he will never turn from it. I think that's something that we need to consider as we listen to others around us, especially younger people. What is it that we can gain from them? Joe?
Well, I don't know if you remember, we did a study on that one time, and it's talking about bringing them up into the Lord, but also it's talking about what their nature is. What
Right.
God has created them to be. And so I think it's like a lot of times parents want to say, because I like sports, you're going to like it, or whatever. I'm just using that as an example.
Right.
But God made a certain nature for each of us, and certain like gifts, I guess. And train a child up into those things, I think, is important. Not as important as teaching them about the Lord, but I think we have to look at each child in the family. They're all different.
Right. Yeah.
And we have to, how does God want them to be?
Right. Well, and that's part of listening to our children. Or even children within a congregation, listening to the younger people, knowing what's going on in their minds, listening to what they have to say. Because that's how we're going to be able to have a connection with them. Understanding, I mean, it's like what Dan brought up in class, what he had observed on TV, the hype deal or whatever, and that we have to understand something before we can know how to deal with it. I had never heard of that before. I wouldn't know how to deal with that because I don't know what it's all about, you know. But if we learn that, hey, this is pushing on your emotions here, that's what it's doing. It's not really doing you any benefit as far as praising God or worshiping Him. It's just stirring your emotions up. If we listen to people, then we can gather more information that we can make a conscientious decision on. And that's like listening to our kids. You know, kids are very inquisitive. They ask questions. Sometimes we think, you know, do I have to put up with this? I mean, this kid. But that gives us an idea of what those kids are like. If we had someone like Jesus at 12 years old come in here and start talking, would we listen to him? He's at 12. If he came in here and started saying things, you know, and like, we don't want to listen to him. Would we have that attitude? Or would we truly listen to him and say, you know, he's got something to say here?
Yes, it depends on what he's saying.
Exactly. And that's what we need to be listening for. How many times have we listened to something and we've never really caught on to what they were saying?
Lots of times.
Because we weren't really, truly trying to listen. One of the examples in this study was talking about Hannah in 1 Samuel, and it's kind of a lengthy story, but it's a good one, I think, in the fact that Hannah was one of the wives of Elkanah. The other wife was Peninnah, I think it is. And Peninnah had children, and Hannah didn't. And Hannah was disturbed about it. She was upset. She was angry. And mainly because the other wife was digging at her, making fun of her. You're not fruitful. And Hannah was upset. She prays to the Lord. Even in her upsetness, she calms down enough and prays to the Lord that, Lord, look down on your servant and help me that I can bear a child. And if you do, I will turn him over to you. He will be your servant. And at that time, Eli was the prophet, I guess, then, the priest, I guess it was. And when Hannah was praying, in 1 Samuel 1, verse 8, actually it was in 9. Once they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. And she made a vow, saying, O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life. And no razor will ever be used on his head, which basically was the Nazirite vow. Same thing that Samson had. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk, and said to her, How long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine. "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I am pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the Lord of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." When she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Then, as it goes on through the story, then she conceives. She has a son. His name is Samuel. She devotes him to the Lord. And at that time, from what I understood, basically it was from like 25 to 40 is when you were basically a devoted priest or whatever. As she said, it was his whole life. As we know, Eli had sons that were not in God's favor. They were doing evil. So, as you would read on through the passage there, you'll see where, and we might possibly get to that tonight, where Samuel is hearing voices, and he thinks it's Eli calling to him, but it's actually the Lord, God. But in this situation, Hannah is grieved, very grieved. And I'm thinking, her husband, I don't think he's really listening to her. He's not really understanding what's going on. As they would go to the sacrifices, he would give some of the sacrificed meat to the Peninnah, the wife that had children, and then he would give a double portion to her, and she wouldn't eat it. And he said, why won't you eat this? And he just did not understand what was going through her mind. She wanted to be fruitful for him. So in anguish, she goes and she prays. And it was interesting that Eli sees her pray. But what does he immediately think?
Drunkenness.
She's drunk. She's praying out of anguish. Her lips are moved, but there's no voice. But he immediately thinks that she's on the sauce. This is not right. But she explains to him, I'm in terrible pain. She tells the Lord, this is what I would like. And at the end, she goes away and what? She's resolved, isn't she? As it said, she goes away and Eli says, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Love.
That happened to Sarah and Bilhah. The maid had Abraham, which was Ishmael, and Bilhah kept harking on Sarah so much and made Sarah mad and told Bilhah to go.
Oh yeah.
And then that was in Genesis, somewhere in Genesis.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, Bilhah didn't, and then the angel came to Bilhah and said, "Hey, go back to Sarah and do what she says."
Yeah. And this, as we read on, she's given a son. The Lord heard her. Then when she goes back, I think it's verse 24, after the boy was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull and an ephah of flour and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. Then they had slaughtered the bull. They brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, "As surely as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord for this whole life. He will be given over to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. Can you imagine what Eli was thinking? I mean, this is the same woman, he said, hey, you're drunk. Get out of here. And yet, he remembered what she had prayed. He had listened. Then she brings him back and dedicates him basically to the Lord for the rest of his life. Not just the normal priesthood, but for his whole life.
Hey Jeff,
Yes.
I was just thinking too about Paul in the New Testament. In 2 Corinthians 10, they were criticizing him.
Mm-hmm.
They were criticizing for they say his letters are weighty and strong, but his personal presence is unimpressive and his speech contemptible. So they didn't like the way he talked.
Right.
So they weren't listening to the message. They were too focused on his speech.
Right.
He was unimpressive, his presence,
Mm-hmm.
and so they weren't listening to what he was saying.
Right.
They were questioning his authority from what he was teaching. So that's another, would that be another aspect of not listening?
Yep. Well, we get a preconceived idea. We get a preconceived idea. If he's not presenting it in a way, that we agree with, then we can immediately shut our ears. We can immediately say, he's not worth listening to. That's why a lot of people that are very eloquent in speech, people listen to them because they're easy to listen to. They're like, it's like, wow, it's just like water flowing over rocks in a stream. It's easy to listen to, and you open your ears. Does that mean it's good to hear? Sometimes it's just to tickle our ears, isn't it? Just to get us to think, hey, yeah, what he's got to say is really good. And yet, we listen more readily because it's not like Paul. It feels good to listen that way. But truly listening is another thing.
Well, they're just too focused on how he was presenting it, I guess.
Yeah.
They're too focused on that and not thinking, listening to what he was saying. And you hear how many times Paul praised for his letters and for everything that he did, but there were still some that were not impressed with how he spoke.
Right. In James 1, I think Dan brought this up a couple of weeks ago. James 1:19, I think is one that, of course, we all need to take this one to heart, no matter what. My dear brothers, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Man.
So hard.
Quick to listen. Quick to listen. How many times do we sometimes take that slow to listen, quick to speak? We get them two changed up, don't we?
I did it a few times today.
And then when that happens, the anger comes real quick then, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's something that we all struggle with. I think in the listening mode, some people are easy to listen to and others are not. And yet, how does God speak to us? Are we listening to God? How does He speak to us? Surely someone's got that answer, don't they?
He speaks to us through the Word. He speaks to us through His nature, His creation.
Exactly. Do we listen to it?
Sometimes not, sometimes do.
Do we listen to it? Like you say, speaks to us through nature. Do we listen to that? When He's showing us things that He has created, are we listening to that? When we read in the Bible, as we're reading along and something strikes us there, it's like, wow, I never seen that before. Are we listening enough to apply it? Or are we just saying, yeah, I never seen that before, and then just go on and figure, well, no need to bother with that. I mean, I just haven't seen that before. Because when we listen, how are we supposed to apply what we listen? The next example is still in 1 Samuel, but we're going to go to chapter 3. Starting in verse 1. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. One night Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call you. Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down, and again the Lord called, "Samuel." And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." "My son Eli, I did not call you. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not know yet that the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel a third time, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel." And it goes on and he talks about what he is basically is going to do with Eli and his family, the rotten sons. But the Lord called Samuel 3 times, didn't he? And what did Samuel think who was calling? It was Eli, wasn't it? Well, it has to be Eli. But yet, 3 times Eli said, "No, it wasn't me." And that's when Eli said, "You know what? This is probably the Lord calling you, so this is how you should answer." How many times does it take us to be told by God sometimes something before we realize it's God that's talking to us? Whether it be through Scripture, through preaching, through Bible studies, whatever it might be. How many times does God have to say it before we understand that, hey, this is God talking to me? Because many times we're not really listening. We hear it, but we're not taking it to heart. Again.
Proverbs 18 and verse 2 says, "A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion."
Mm-hmm.
And that's sometimes what happens. It says a fool's lips walks into his mouth, and a fool's lips walks into a fight in verse 6.
Yep.
His mouth invites a beating, and a fool's mouth can ruin his lips as a snare to his soul. The thing of it is, we know, but we don't want to listen.
Right.
We only want our feelings expressed
Mm-hmm.
and our thoughts magnified. So we don't want to listen to correction or what God wants us to
Right.
listen to.
Slow to speak,
Right.
quick to listen. We always get it opposite, don't we?
Yeah.
We are slow to listen and quick to speak. We think, yeah, well, I got it. I got this. I know exactly. And yet, there's many times that we don't. We don't have it. When I'm trying to put this into words. When God talks to us through the Word, are we always quick to listen to what He has to say? Or are we quick to say, that's not, kind of like what Dan said, that's not really what I want. That's not what my opinion of the Bible is. That's not what my opinion of that verse is. And we're quick to not really listen to what it's telling us. And we're quick to say, no, that's not what that means. And yet, it's coming from His Word. I think many times we do have a tendency to say, oh, I already know. I already know. And yet, we really don't. We really don't know all that we should.
I think we're ignorant over the Word.
What's that?
I think we're ignorant over the Word.
I think a lot of times we can be. We can be very ignorant of it. But what does the Word say? There is no more time for ignorance, is there? We can't plead ignorance that, well, I didn't know. Because we have it all right here. And go ahead, Roger.
Sometimes you don't know, but you know it's wrong because it contradicts other scriptures.
Exactly.
So you don't have to, know everything, but if it contradicts another scripture, then somebody's not interpreting it right.
Right. Because we know this is true, no matter what. All of this is true. So if somebody said, well, yeah, but this doesn't line up with that, well then they're probably wrong because it does all line up. It's all right there.
People try to bend it to
Right.
mean something it doesn't really mean.
And when they do that, and they speak it, are we listening to that? And digesting it and figuring out, okay, no, that's not right? Or do we just figure, hey, because they said it, that must be the way it is? Because there's many people today that do not want to get into the Word. They just want to listen to someone that speaks eloquently. They just want to be, as we said, entertained. They want to be entertained. God, boy, that sounds so good. And the more they talk, the more they just start taking it in. And absorbing that and thinking, well, he's saying a lot of the things that I really like to hear. And they take that in. Does that mean it's true? Because it's easy to hear? How many things in the Bible are so easy to hear that we just really like all of it? I do not like the part where it says, if you're going to live godly, you're going to suffer persecution. I don't like that. Do I have to accept it? Yes. I have to accept it. If I'm going to live godly, I am going to suffer persecution. Or I can do the other and not live godly and probably still suffer, maybe not persecution, but I'm still going to suffer. Guaranteed.
Hey, Jeff.
Yes.
So I'm kind of, a question, I guess. When you talk about somebody speaking eloquently, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that.
No, I'm not saying there isn't, but I'm saying that some people speak eloquently and they're more apt to be listened to because they are speaking eloquently.
So this has to be what the message is.
Exactly. We have to listen to the message, not necessarily the way it's presented. We have to listen to the message. It's like what you pointed out with Paul. Was his message correct? Absolutely. Was it presented in a way that people liked it? No. Because it says right there, they didn't like the way he spoke. Moses, how good of a speaker was Moses? He wasn't good at all, was he? He knew it and God knew it, didn't he? So what did God do? Gave him help.
In Mary.
And it's the same thing. Some people have a knack, and some people don't. But they can be presenting the same lesson, and some people will catch on to it way quicker because it's presented in a different way. Is that the light?
Well, there's a
I thought my eye was going there.
Well, there was, I think, there was a young man, who was a member of the church, this was a long time ago. He wanted to be a preacher, he was going to school, but he had a really, really bad stutter.
Right.
And I admired him, he came to talk and practice as a student. Well, he had a hard time getting started. But I admired him because he was still speaking the truth.
Right.
But boy, could he stutter.
Yep.
But the more he talked, the better he got.
Right.
So I always thought that was something that felt that strong to do that will of God, even though he stuttered
Even though
so bad.
he felt probably pretty self-conscious about that part. So, do you have devotional tonight?
Yeah, that
Okay.
short one. You're wrapping it up.
Well, I'll probably just wrap that up there then, and I'll give Dan some time here. If you want to mark page 940, only a step, first and last verses for our invitational.
We just have to be careful because a lot of times, especially you see it in political terms, there are people who are very charismatic. And those are the people who are going to capture you, and you get lost in them as opposed to what they're saying.